Madeline, the elegant yet emotionally detached wife of powerful and enigmatic CEO Jacob Harris, leads a double life. Believing her husband's cold demeanor and mysterious schedule mean emotional detachment, she falls into an affair with a charming but manipulative coworker. Their teenage son, Ethan, quiet and observant, slowly unravels the web of lies while dealing with his own emotional neglect. Jacob has known all along, watching, waiting, and collecting truth not just for revenge, but for something deeper. When Ethan bravely confronts his mother during a public company event, the family fractures. What follows is a long, painful journey of revelations, regrets, and reckoning. The ending leaves room for forgiveness, but not without irreversible consequences. Madeline Harris stood by the window of her tastefully decorated suburban home, watching the sunset bleed orange over the treetops. The house was quiet, as it often was. Dinner sat untouched on the dining table, slowly growing cold under the dim chandelier. Outside, the faint sound of traffic hummed like a distant memory of life. Inside, everything was perfect. At least it looked that way. She had always played the part well. The devoted wife of Jacob Harris, one of the most respected CEOs in the state. Her days were a symphony of well-timed rituals, morning yoga, charity meetings, school drop-offs for Ethan, and evening meals precisely at 6:30. Their lives were orderly, elegant, enviable. But beneath the symmetry, cracks had begun to form. Jacob was never home on time anymore. He worked late, left early, and carried an air of detachment that had hardened over the years. At first, Madeline thought it was stress. Then she blamed the company, the constant pressure, the impossible expectations of leading thousands. But as time passed, she began to wonder if his distance was less about work and more about her. She couldn't remember the last time he touched her face gently or asked how she really felt. He provided everything: security, reputation, comfort, but not affection, not connection. In the silence of their pristine home, Madeline often found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone, smiling wedding pictures, family vacations, Ethan's chubby cheeks as a toddler. They felt like relics from a different life, a life where Jacob used to laugh, where she used to feel something real. Now they barely spoke. When they did, it was polite, formal, as though they were business partners living under the same roof. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen island, the marble surface cool against her skin. Her phone buzzed, lighting up with a message. It was from Owen, a colleague from the architecture firm she joined last year. "You looked beautiful today. Wish we could have talked longer." A smile flickered across her lips, unbidden, quickly followed by a pang of guilt. She told herself it was harmless. Owen was kind, attentive. He remembered the smallest things, like how she took her coffee or what book she was reading, things Jacob hadn't noticed in years. Upstairs, Ethan's bedroom door remained shut. He had always been a quiet child, observant, far more perceptive than his age should allow. At 14, he rarely asked questions, but Madeline could sense his awareness. He noticed the tension, the long silences at dinner, the way she flinched when Jacob entered the room. Lately, she'd caught him looking at her with something like confusion in his eyes. Or was it disappointment? Jacob arrived home late that night. As always, he didn't apologize. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his tie, and muttered a tired, "Hey." She watched him pour himself a drink and walk past her without a second glance. His presence filled the space, but he felt miles away. She wanted to say something, anything. Ask him where he'd been. Tell him how lonely she felt. But the words never came. Instead, she nodded, offered a faint smile, and turned back to her wine. The distance between them had become a familiar ache, one she no longer expected to heal. Later, as she lay in bed beside him, both turned to opposite sides, both awake in silence, she wondered if Jacob knew. if he sensed what was slowly happening, if he could feel her slipping away. The truth was, he did. He knew more than she imagined, but for now he said nothing. And so the illusion continued, flawless on the outside, hollow at the core. Owen Blake had a smile that made people lean in. Not just charming, intentional. It was the way he spoke, how he listened, how he let silence stretch just long enough to feel personal. Madeline noticed it the first time he stopped by her desk at the firm, asking about a presentation slide she'd designed. His compliment wasn't grand, just quietly appreciative. "You have an eye for balance," he'd said. She remembered blushing, then brushing it off as nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Their interactions grew naturally, like vines in forgotten corners. Coffee breaks turned into lunchtime walks. Texts that started as professional check-ins became late-night conversations. They never spoke of crossing any lines. They didn't need to. The line had already blurred. At home, Madeline carried a growing sense of guilt, yet it never seemed to outweigh the thrill of being seen. She told herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Not yet. But each message from Owen, each glance, each compliment, felt like a thread pulling her farther away from the life she had built with Jacob. And she didn't resist it. Meanwhile, Ethan watched from the sidelines. 14, quiet, sharp-eyed. He wasn't a child anymore, not really. He noticed how his mother now smiled at her phone when she thought no one was looking. He noticed how she lingered in front of the mirror more than before, or how she chose heels on casual Fridays. It didn't make sense, not yet, but he could feel something was shifting. At school, Ethan didn't talk much. He wasn't the kind of kid who shared his thoughts easily, but he wrote pages and pages. His notebook, buried deep in his backpack, became a place where he recorded everything he saw. Not out of suspicion, but confusion. He didn't know what to do with the feelings building inside him. Restlessness, unease, fear. One evening he overheard a phone call. Madeline was in the living room, pacing softly, unaware that Ethan had come down the stairs for water. Her voice was low, hushed, but warm in a way it never was with Jacob. She laughed, really laughed, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in months. Then came the words, "I wish I could see you tomorrow. I miss you already." Ethan froze. Something cold settled in his chest. He backed away, climbed the stairs quietly, and shut his door without a sound. Downstairs, Madeline ended the call, unaware that a storm had begun to form inside her son. Across town, Jacob sat alone in his office, staring at a security camera feed from their home. He had installed it quietly months ago, not to spy, but to confirm. He never watched it in real time, but tonight, something made him press play. There she was, pacing, smiling, speaking in a voice that hadn't been meant for him in a long time. He didn't react. No outburst, no anger. Just a tightening in his jaw and a slow exhale. Jacob wasn't the kind of man who acted without certainty. His silence wasn't born of ignorance. It was strategy. While Madeline drifted further into her secret, and Ethan began to unravel in silence, Jacob was already building his own version of the truth. He didn't confront. He observed. And he waited. Because sometimes the cruelest kind of justice is the one that arrives too late for apologies. In this story, though still wearing its mask of perfection, had already begun to split wide open. Madeline told herself boundaries still existed. She wasn't sleeping with Owen. Not yet. They hadn't kissed, hadn't touched beyond a brief brush of hands in the elevator. And yet the intimacy between them had already grown deeper than she wanted to admit. Every message felt like oxygen, every compliment like water to roots that had long dried up. She was coming alive again, but not in the way that made her proud. It wasn't love, not really, more like an escape. Owen made her feel beautiful, important, desired. He asked questions Jacob never bothered with anymore. What was her favorite movie? Did she believe people could truly change? Did she ever feel trapped in her own life? She answered carefully at first. Then she stopped being careful. One rainy afternoon, Owen invited her for a late lunch at a quiet cafe across town. She almost said no, but she didn't. The meal was simple, the conversation easy. She laughed more than she had in months. When he leaned in across the table and said softly, "You deserve to be happy, Madeline," she didn't flinch. She smiled. And when he offered her a ride back to work, she accepted. In the car, they didn't speak for a while. The rain hit the windshield in soft rhythms. Just before he pulled into the parking garage, Owen turned to her. His voice was low, deliberate. "You don't have to explain yourself, but I think you already know what you want, even if you're still pretending you don't." That night, as she lay in bed beside Jacob, her heart beat in a strange, unsteady rhythm. He was reading something on his phone, silent as always. She turned away, staring at the ceiling, feeling both guilty and numb. She didn't know Jacob had already read her messages, had already memorized Owen's name, had already traced every digital trail, every meeting, every moment she thought was hidden. He had found the first clue weeks ago, an unsent email on the family iPad. She'd started typing and forgotten to erase it. Jacob didn't confront her. He only watched her more closely. He knew her routines, her tells, the way she started wearing perfume again, the new lipstick, the excuses that didn't quite fit. But Jacob wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He believed in timing, in leverage, in letting people dig their own graves, slowly, thoroughly. Meanwhile, Ethan began to change in ways Madeline hadn't noticed. He spent more time alone, stopped inviting friends over, stopped laughing at the old sitcoms they used to watch together. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring blankly at his plate. Madeline asked if something was wrong. He didn't answer. He just shook his head and went to his room. Upstairs, Ethan opened his journal. He flipped past pages of drawings, thoughts, and observations. Then he began to write what he had overheard, what he had seen, what he thought it all meant. His handwriting trembled, but his words were clear. "I think Mom is lying. I think she's seeing someone. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm disappearing." Jacob read that journal 2 days later, not because he went looking for it, but because Ethan left it on the kitchen counter by mistake. Jacob stood there unmoving, reading each word slowly. By the end, he wasn't angry. He was heartbroken. Not because of Madeline, but because their son had been left alone in the wreckage of their silence. Still, he said nothing. In their home, love had long since been replaced with performance. Everyone knew their lines. Everyone stayed in character. But in the quiet spaces, in the dark hallways and the missed glances, truth had begun to whisper, and it would not stay silent for much longer. Ethan had always been a quiet boy, the kind who listened more than he spoke. In school, teachers described him as thoughtful, observant, polite. At home, he was the invisible thread between his parents, unnoticed when tensions rose, forgotten in the silences that filled their evenings. But Ethan saw everything. He saw the way his mother smiled at her phone when she thought no one was watching. He noticed how she dressed differently now, subtly but with intention. Her makeup was softer, her heels a little higher. He noticed how she flinched when his father came home late, how her energy changed when she heard his car in the driveway. Jacob, for all his power and precision in business, was a ghost in their house. He didn't shout or demand. He simply arrived, ate dinner in silence, and disappeared into his office or their bedroom. There were no arguments, no scenes, just distance, and Ethan was left floating in between, feeling like a ghost himself. He started writing more. At first it was just thoughts, things he couldn't say out loud. Then it became something else, a way to keep track, to try and understand. He wrote what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. The journal became his only outlet, his only friend. It held things he didn't dare tell anyone, not his teachers, not his friends, and certainly not his parents. One night, he stayed up late listening. His mother was in the kitchen, whispering on the phone. Her voice was gentle, warmer than it ever was with Jacob. Ethan didn't want to hear, but he couldn't help it. "I miss you too." "No, not tonight." "He's home. Maybe tomorrow." The words echoed in Ethan's chest like a hollow drum beat. He went back to his room, closed the door, and sat on the floor beside his bed. The anger didn't come right away. It started as confusion, then disappointment, then something deeper, a sadness he didn't know how to carry. At breakfast the next morning, he looked at his mother carefully. She poured juice, asked if he needed a ride to school, smiled like everything was fine. Ethan nodded but said nothing. Jacob sat at the head of the table, flipping through emails, his face unreadable. The three of them sat there, eating in silence, pretending not to know the truth. Later that week, Ethan approached his father in the garage. He didn't plan to. He just found himself standing there, hands in his pockets, while Jacob checked something under the hood of his car. "Dad," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "can I ask you something?" Jacob looked up, surprised. It had been a long time since Ethan had asked him anything. "Of course. Do you think people change?" Ethan's eyes didn't move. "Like when they lie, can they still be good?" Jacob wiped his hands with a towel, then leaned back against the car. His gaze was steady, but not hard. "Sometimes people lie because they're scared," he said slowly. "Sometimes because they're selfish. And sometimes they don't even know they're lying until it's too late." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He turned and walked back into the house without another word. That night, Jacob sat alone in his office, staring at the same security footage he had watched a dozen times before. Madeline laughing on the phone, her voice soft and full of warmth. A version of her he hadn't seen in years. He thought of Ethan, his stillness, his question, his quiet grief. Jacob wasn't afraid of losing Madeline. He had already lost her. But he was terrified of losing his son with the same silence that had swallowed their marriage. The next day, Jacob called in sick to work. He picked Ethan up from school, just the two of them. No explanation. They drove without a destination, ending up by the old marina where Jacob used to take him fishing. They didn't fish that day. They just sat on a bench listening to the water and letting the wind move around them. "You're not invisible," Jacob said quietly, staring out at the waves. Ethan looked at him, surprised. "I see you," Jacob continued, "even when it feels like no one else does." It was the first time in a long time that Ethan let himself cry. In that moment, no one talked about affairs or betrayal. There were no confessions, no anger, just a father and son trying to hold on to something real before everything else slipped away. And somewhere inside the quiet, a decision began to form, not just in Ethan's heart, but in Jacob's. They couldn't stop what was coming, but they could choose how to face it. Jacob Harris had never been an open book. From the outside, people saw a brilliant strategist, a calm and calculated leader. He didn't raise his voice in boardrooms, didn't scramble when markets shifted. He adapted, controlled, survived. That was the version of him his employees admired, even feared. But few knew what shaped him. Long before the wealth and tailored suits, Jacob was a boy growing up in a quiet, broken town in Pennsylvania. His father had walked out when he was 10, leaving behind debt and silence. His mother, once a kind schoolteacher, turned cold with bitterness, working 2 jobs and blaming Jacob for a life that had slipped through her fingers. Love to Jacob had always been conditional, something earned, never freely given. So he learned to perform, to achieve, to control. He met Madeline in college when he still believed success could rewrite the past. She was everything he wasn't: warm, expressive, lighthearted. She laughed with her whole body. She dreamed without apology. For a time, he let himself be pulled into her world. He proposed on a snowy evening, nervous and trembling for the first time in years. But marriage didn't erase his ghosts. The more successful he became, the more he retreated into structure. The stakes grew higher. The love they once shared began to fade beneath the weight of schedules, silent dinners, and 100 unspoken disappointments. When Ethan was born, Jacob told himself he would be different. He would be present. But as years passed, he watched himself become the same shadow his father had once been. Still, he believed Madeline was loyal. Distant, perhaps, restless, but loyal. That illusion shattered the moment he saw the first message. It had been a chance discovery, a notification flashing on the iPad left open on the kitchen counter. A preview of a text from Owen. Nothing explicit, but intimate enough. Jacob read it twice before closing the app. His stomach turned, but he said nothing. Instead, he made a choice. He would not confront her out of emotion. He would observe quietly, precisely, until he understood the full truth. He paid a private investigator, not out of rage, but out of clarity. He gathered timestamps, security footage, emails, even Owen's employment file. Each detail was another piece of the puzzle. The more he saw, the more he realized this wasn't a phase. Madeline had emotionally left him a long time ago. The man she was becoming wasn't the woman he married. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely innocent either. Still, what angered him most wasn't the betrayal. It was Ethan. Their son, barely 15, was walking through the minefield of their marriage alone, carrying burdens he didn't deserve, writing pain into notebooks, staring through dinners in quiet misery. And Jacob had been too consumed with strategy to see it sooner. He began spending more time with Ethan, picking him up from school, sitting with him in the evenings. Nothing forced, just presence. One night they watched an old movie together on the couch, the kind they hadn't seen since Ethan was a kid. Jacob didn't say much. He just let his son lean against him, let the silence be soft instead of sharp. But even as Jacob reconnected with his son, he watched Madeline drift further away. One evening, he followed her, discreetly, in an unmarked car. She said she had a late meeting. Instead, she met Owen at a quiet corner cafe. They sat close, shoulders brushing, laughter spilling from the table like wine. When Owen reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Jacob didn't photograph it. He didn't need to. Some betrayals didn't require proof. They branded themselves in memory. That night, he returned home before her. She came in late, cheeks flushed, murmuring something about deadlines and traffic. He simply nodded, closed his laptop, and said he was heading to bed. She looked at him then, really looked at him. For a moment, her smile faltered. Maybe she sensed something had changed, but she didn't ask. She just walked past him, up the stairs and into the bathroom. Jacob stood alone in the hallway, his hands resting on the banister. There was still time to confront her, still time to demand the truth. But he didn't want screaming or denial. He didn't want apologies born from fear. He wanted her to reveal herself, on her own, in her own words, because the man he used to be would have exploded. But the man he had become, through pain, control, and the love of a son he almost lost, was waiting for the moment when Madeline would have no choice but to see herself clearly. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be in the quiet safety of their kitchen. It would be under lights, with witnesses, at a place where masks could no longer be worn. He was no longer just a husband. He was a father, a strategist, and a man who had learned the hard way that love without truth was nothing more than a performance, and Jacob Harris was done pretending. The Harris household had become a stage, and everyone inside played their role. Breakfasts were timed down to the minute. Conversations were light, casual, intentionally void of anything too real. Madeline smiled with precision, poured juice for Ethan, and kissed Jacob's cheek out of routine, not affection. Jacob responded with the same practiced warmth, his eyes never betraying the truth he carried. And Ethan, he played the part of the unbothered teen, headphones in, eyes down, mind miles away. No one raised their voice. No one argued. That was the danger of silence. It could wear the mask of peace while suffocating everything underneath. Madeline believed she still had control over the situation. She told herself Jacob didn't know. He was too focused on the company, too emotionally distant to notice the changes. If he sensed anything, he hadn't said a word. And that, in her mind, meant she could keep living in between. Between the husband she had once loved and the man who now made her feel wanted again. But the truth was catching up to her, and fast. At work, Owen grew bolder. No longer satisfied with hidden meetings and cautious touches, he started dropping hints in front of others. Lingering glances, flirty jokes that hovered just on the edge of propriety. Madeline warned him to be more careful, but he only laughed. "What are you afraid of?" he asked one afternoon, brushing a hand along her arm in the hallway. "He doesn't even see you, Madeline. I do." She didn't answer, because a part of her knew Owen didn't see her either. Not the real her, the tired woman beneath the perfect clothes, the mother trying to hold on to a crumbling family, the wife drowning in shame. He only saw the version of her she let him see. And the person who saw more than anyone else was Ethan. He didn't have to search for evidence anymore. It was all there, in her voice, her timing, her absence. He began to look at her differently, not with the innocent affection of a child, but with the quiet, guarded suspicion of someone who had seen too much too soon. When she asked about school, he gave short answers. When she touched his shoulder, he stiffened. He didn't say what he knew. Not yet, but the distance between them was no longer subtle. One evening, Madeline stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, watching Jacob out in the backyard with Ethan. They were tossing a football, something they hadn't done in years. Ethan laughed, really laughed, and Jacob's eyes crinkled with something like joy. It startled her. She had spent so long believing Jacob didn't care, that he had drifted so far away, emotionally and physically, that nothing could bring him back. But in that moment, she saw something that didn't fit the narrative she had created. Connection, intention, presence. Later that night, she asked him softly, almost afraid to break the fragile air between them. "You and Ethan, you seem closer lately." Jacob looked up from his book. "I've been trying," he said simply. Madeline hesitated. "You're a good father." He met her eyes for the first time in days. "I wasn't, not for a long time." She swallowed hard, her guilt pressing against her like a weight she could no longer ignore. Across town, the company was preparing for its annual charity gala, a formal affair attended by executives, clients, and the press. Madeline had always taken pride in planning her role there, standing beside Jacob as the perfect couple, admired and envied by the public. But this year, something felt different. Jacob was quiet when she brought it up. "It'll be good for the family," he said, then added, "Ethan should come too." She hesitated. "He hates those things. He should see what we built." Madeline agreed, but unease settled in her chest. Something about the way Jacob spoke. It was careful, chosen, as if every word carried a second meaning. The night of the gala arrived with rain on the pavement and flashes from photographers outside the hotel ballroom. Madeline wore a silver gown, elegant and understated. Jacob, in his black suit, looked every bit the powerful CEO. And Ethan, reluctantly dressed in a dark blazer, walked a few steps behind them, quiet but watchful. Inside, the room buzzed with music and conversation. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, Guests moved through the ballroom like dancers in a play. Madeline smiled, nodded, posed for pictures, shook hands. She saw Owen across the room, speaking with a colleague, and quickly looked away. But not before she noticed the way his eyes lingered too long. The moment passed, but the tension didn't. Ethan stood near the back, away from the cameras watching. Not just the people, his parents, their movements, their masks. He had a journal in his inside pocket, a folded page, a decision made. The family had spent months pretending, but tonight the truth was coming, whether they were ready or not. The ballroom shimmered with light, its crystal chandeliers scattering golden reflections across marble floors and polished shoes. Every guest looked the part, powerful, composed, untouchable. But Ethan Harris wasn't looking at them. He was watching his mother. Madeline moved through the crowd like she had so many times before. Poised, gracious, perfect. Her laughter sounded easy, her compliments well-timed. No one would guess the truth behind the smile. No one would see the guilt resting just beneath her collarbone. But Ethan saw it. He stood alone near the back wall, the folded piece of paper in his pocket feeling heavier with each passing minute. It was a letter, a page torn from his journal. Not an accusation, but a confession. His. Everything he had seen, everything he had felt, everything he had written down when the silence in their house became too loud to bear. He hadn't meant to bring it tonight, but something in his chest told him the pretending had to end. Tonight. Jacob stood near the center of the room, surrounded by investors, shaking hands, exchanging rehearsed pleasantries. But every few moments his eyes would flick toward his son. He saw the stiffness in Ethan's posture. He saw the clenched jaw, the darting gaze. And Jacob knew. The moment they had all been circling around was finally closing in. Dinner was served, speeches began. Madeline was scheduled to speak briefly, just a few words of gratitude on behalf of the Harris family for the foundation's donors. It was a role she had played many times. She stepped onto the stage as the room quieted. The spotlight caught the shine in her eyes and the tremble in her hand. "Thank you," she began, voice steady. "We're honored to host you again this year. Jacob and I have always believed in building not just a company, but a community. And tonight is a reminder of how far we've come and what we still have to protect." She smiled toward Jacob. He gave a small, measured nod. That was when Ethan stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. Just a teenage boy, walking toward the stage, his face pale and unreadable. But then he climbed the first step, then the second. Madeline turned, confused. "Ethan, can I say something?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the room's buzz. Every head turned. Madeline's smile froze. "Sweetheart, maybe—" "Please," Ethan said, not to her, but to Jacob. Jacob nodded once, calm, controlled, letting it happen. Ethan turned to the crowd. His hands shook as he unfolded the paper. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," he said, voice unsteady. "But I can't keep pretending. Not anymore." The room held its breath. "My mom, she's been lying to all of you, to my dad, to me." Madeline went cold. A gasp rippled through the room. Owen, standing near the back, stiffened but didn't move. Ethan kept reading. "I've watched her sneak out. I've read the messages. I've heard the calls. I wrote it down because I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I didn't say anything, maybe it would go away. But it didn't." He looked up. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired, wounded. "I'm not doing this to hurt you, Mom. I'm doing it because I needed someone to tell the truth." A silence fell so thick it muffled even the background music. Madeline's hands were trembling. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her carefully built world, this image, this family, was cracking in full view of everyone. Jacob stepped forward then slowly. He reached for the microphone, not to take it, but to steady it. "Ethan's right," he said softly. "We've all been pretending. For too long." He turned to his son and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for being brave when the rest of us weren't." The applause didn't come. Not yet. No one moved. The spell of perfection had shattered, and what remained was raw, exposed truth. Madeline stood alone on the stage, the spotlight now harsh on her skin. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not just from humiliation, but from the sudden, terrifying clarity of what she had become. She looked at Jacob. He didn't look away. She looked at Ethan, and he did. That was what hurt the most. Later, when the event ended in a strange, quiet blur, the Harris family rode home in silence. No arguments, no explanations, just the sound of the tires against wet pavement and three people who, for the first time, were no longer pretending. And in that silence, consequences were already taking shape. The morning after the gala, the Harris household was unnervingly quiet. The air held the weight of a storm that had passed, leaving behind a different kind of wreckage. Not broken furniture or torn clothes, but fractured trust and a silence that no one dared to break. Madeline sat alone at the kitchen table, still in her silk robe, her coffee untouched. The light streaming in from the windows made everything look deceptively calm. But inside her chest, chaos churned. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's face on that stage. So young, so hurt, so heartbreakingly honest. Upstairs, Ethan hadn't left his room. He hadn't spoken a word since they returned home the night before. The note he had read was still on his desk, crumpled but not torn. He had nothing more to say. He had already said it all. And Jacob, he hadn't touched her since the truth came out. He hadn't yelled, hadn't thrown accusations, hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply withdrawn into silence, the kind that cut deeper than any words could. By mid-morning, Jacob came down the stairs dressed in a black sweater and jeans. He looked exhausted but composed. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a coffee, and stood across from Madeline without sitting. "I'm going to take Ethan to the cabin for a few days," he said calmly. Madeline blinked. "The cabin? He needs space. And right now, I don't think he wants it here." She opened her mouth to object, but nothing came out. How could she argue? How could she pretend anymore? Jacob took a slow sip of coffee before setting it down. His eyes locked on hers, tired but clear. "I'm not making any decisions right now," he added, "about us, about this family. But something needs to change." She nodded slowly, her throat too tight to speak. "I didn't plan for it to happen this way," she finally whispered. "It was a mistake. It got out of control, but I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being—" "Don't," Jacob interrupted gently but firmly. "Don't try to explain it away. You knew what you were doing. You just didn't think anyone would find out. That hurt more than yelling would have." She bit her lip and looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Upstairs, Ethan was packing. Not a lot, just a bag of clothes, a couple books, and his journal. When Jacob knocked gently on the door, Ethan opened it without a word. "You ready?" Jacob asked. Ethan nodded. Neither of them said anything as they walked out the door. Madeline stood by the window, watching them pull away in silence. She didn't cry. Not yet. The grief hadn't fully formed, because she still didn't know what she was losing. At the cabin, the quiet was different, cleaner, less tense. Jacob lit the fireplace while Ethan sat on the couch, staring at the flames. "I'm sorry it had to be you," Jacob said eventually. "To tell the truth." Ethan looked over, unsure how to respond. He hadn't expected his father to take his side. In truth, he hadn't known what to expect at all. "I didn't do it to hurt her," Ethan said. "I just couldn't keep pretending." Jacob nodded. You shouldn't have to. The two of them sat there for a long time. No screens, no distractions, just the crackle of the fire and the slow healing of something that had been quietly breaking for years. Back at the house, Madeline spent the afternoon moving through rooms like a ghost. Every photo on the wall, every trophy on the shelf, now felt like a cruel reminder of the life she had worked so hard to polish. And now, she wasn't sure if any of it could be salvaged. When evening fell, she picked up her phone and typed a message to Owen. "We can't talk anymore. Please don't contact me." She stared at it for several minutes before finally hitting send. It was a small act. Too small, maybe, but it was a start. She sat on the couch, alone, as night wrapped itself around the empty house. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself cry. Not out of fear, not out of guilt, but out of the terrifying realization that loving someone wasn't enough when you had already destroyed their trust. And the question that haunted her now was no longer if Jacob would forgive her, but if Ethan ever could. The cabin in upstate New York was surrounded by pines and quiet. It had always been Jacob's retreat, a place he came to think, to breathe. Now it had become a sanctuary not just for him, but for Ethan too. For the first time in weeks, neither of them had to perform, pretend, or navigate around unspoken tension. The days passed slowly. Jacob let Ethan set the pace. They cooked simple meals, hiked a little when the weather held, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes just being. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Ethan finally broke the long silence. "Did you ever cheat on Mom?" he asked softly, eyes fixed on the flickering flame. Jacob took a long breath, caught off guard not by the question, but by the pain laced beneath it. "No," he said quietly. "I never did. Not because I'm perfect, but because I knew what betrayal did to a person. My father had an affair when I was your age. My mother never recovered from it. I swore I'd never do that to my family." Ethan nodded, then rubbed his hands together nervously. "I thought maybe you already knew," Ethan said, "that you just didn't care anymore. Like maybe you checked out a long time ago." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I knew something was wrong. She was distant, distracted, but I convinced myself it was stress, or that we were just going through a rough patch. I never imagined it would be someone else." Ethan's shoulders dropped a little, like a small weight had been lifted. "I didn't mean to humiliate her," Ethan added. "I know," Jacob said, "but she wasn't the one being humiliated. You were just telling the truth." There was something healing in the way Jacob said it. It didn't erase the chaos of the last few weeks, but it offered Ethan something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Back in the city, Madeline walked through a house that no longer felt like hers. Without Ethan's laughter, without Jacob's quiet footsteps, everything echoed. The silence was heavier than any confrontation. She spent her days rereading old journals, flipping through photo albums, forcing herself to look at a time when she still believed she was a good wife, a good mother. But every memory came laced with contradiction. How had she gone from holding Ethan's tiny hand to watching him look at her with such betrayal? How had she let a momentary void with Jacob grow into years of distance? Her phone buzzed. Owen again. She didn't answer. She hadn't responded since that final message. But he was persistent. He always had been. That night she opened a blank document on her laptop and began typing a letter. Not to Jacob, not to Owen, to Ethan. "Dear Ethan, I don't know how to ask for your forgiveness without sounding selfish. The truth is, I don't deserve it. Not now, maybe not ever. What I did wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, over and over again, to put my needs above the people I love. And you're the one who paid the highest price. You stood on that stage and told the world the truth. I was ashamed, but not of you, of myself. You did what I didn't have the courage to do. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that I see you. I hear you. And I am so sorry. Love, Mom. She hit print and folded the letter carefully. For the first time in weeks, her hands felt steady. At the cabin the next morning, Jacob checked the mailbox on a routine supply run and found an envelope with Ethan's name in familiar handwriting. He hesitated, then handed it to Ethan without a word. Ethan stared at it for a long time before opening it. He read in silence, eyes skimming the lines, jaw clenched. When he finished, he folded it again and sat quietly. Jacob didn't ask what it said. He simply placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze. That evening, Ethan walked out to the lake behind the cabin. The water was still, a mirror of the sky. He stood there for a while, watching the reflection of clouds drift by. Then he took the letter from his jacket, read it one more time, and held it tight against his chest. He didn't forgive her, not yet, but a small part of him, the part that still remembered bedtime stories and her arms wrapped around him after nightmares, wanted to. And sometimes wanting to forgive was the first step. The late autumn wind curled through the pines like a whisper from the past. Jacob watched from the porch as Ethan stood by the lake again, his shoulders straighter than they had been days ago. Still burdened, but no longer crumbling under it. Healing came quietly, Jacob knew, not in declarations, but in subtle changes, a softened look, a steadier breath, a willingness to stay. Inside the cabin, Jacob's phone buzzed. He almost ignored it until he saw the name. Madeline. He hesitated, then answered, voice quiet. I didn't expect you to pick up, she said. I wasn't going to, he replied honestly. There was a pause. I sent Ethan a letter. I know. Did he read it? He did. Jacob didn't say more. He wanted her to feel the weight of her own uncertainty, not ease it for her. I meant every word, she continued. I didn't write it to earn forgiveness. I just wanted him to know I still see him, still love him. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch before he finally spoke. Loving someone doesn't mean much when you've broken the one thing they counted on, your honesty. Madeline's voice was a whisper. I know. You broke him, Maddie, and you didn't even realize it until he had to tell the world who you really were. I didn't want to hurt him. But you did, Jacob said, because you were hurting. And instead of facing it with me, you chose to escape into someone else. Madeline didn't reply. What could she say? She had already said too much, and not nearly enough. Later that night, Ethan asked Jacob if they could go home. Jacob looked at him carefully. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. I think I need to see her, not to make it better, just to see if I can even look her in the eye. The drive back was long and quiet. They said little, but it was a comfortable silence this time, the kind shared by people who had weathered something together. Jacob hadn't realized just how far they'd both traveled, not just miles, but emotionally, from confusion to grief, from betrayal to fragile understanding. Back in the city, Madeline stood in the living room, nervously adjusting cushions, dusting already spotless frames. She kept glancing at the door. Her heart raced like a child waiting for punishment she knew she deserved. When it finally opened, she stood frozen. Ethan entered first. He didn't hug her, didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. Hi, she said, her voice trembling. He nodded. Hi. Jacob followed, giving Madeline a quiet look, neither warm nor cruel, simply honest. Madeline motioned to the couch, but no one sat. I wanted to say it in person, she said. What I wrote. I'm sorry, not just for what I did, but for who I became. I was so scared of feeling invisible that I made myself someone you couldn't even respect. Ethan's lip quivered, just slightly. I don't know who you are anymore, he said, but I remember who you were. The mom who made grilled cheese and stayed up all night helping me build that stupid volcano for science class. Madeline smiled through tears. That was a disaster. You stayed up, Ethan said. That mattered. He wasn't ready to forgive her, but he wasn't leaving the room either. And in that simple act, Madeline saw the tiniest sliver of hope. Jacob stepped forward. This house isn't what makes us a family, and right now, we're not one. Not fully, but maybe we can get there again, or somewhere close. Madeline looked between the two of them. I want that. I'll do whatever it takes. Ethan didn't reply, but this time his silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge under construction. Fragile, unfinished, but possible. That night, Jacob slept in the guest room. Ethan returned to his room, the posters and baseball trophies all still in place. And Madeline sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering if the woman she used to be was still in there, somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. In a house once cracked by betrayal, something unspoken began to shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the earliest form of something almost as powerful, willingness. The following days settled into a quiet rhythm. Nothing was declared, no promises made, but the tension that once clung to every wall had begun to loosen its grip. Meals were eaten together, not always in silence, but with restraint. Conversations were cautious, like strangers testing the ground after a long winter freeze. Madeline moved carefully through her own home, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. She no longer reached for Jacob's hand, and she stopped trying to explain herself. Her words had caused enough damage. Now she chose presence over persuasion. She cooked breakfast without asking if they'd eat. She left space without walking away. Jacob watched her closely, not with bitterness anymore, but with a kind of distant curiosity. There was a woman in front of him he once loved deeply, someone he shared a life with, and yet there were pieces of her he no longer recognized. Maybe some parts had always been hidden. Maybe some had died in the years they both pretended everything was fine. Ethan, more than anyone, was the quiet center of it all. He didn't speak about the day he exposed his mother's affair, and neither did they. But sometimes he would glance at her across the table, and his expression would soften, not with forgiveness, but with weariness. Like a boy too young to carry this much knowledge, and yet too old to forget it. One afternoon, Jacob found an old photo album tucked in the back of a cabinet. He dusted it off and sat with it at the kitchen table. Ethan wandered in and took a seat beside him, saying nothing. Together they flipped through memories, birthday parties, trips to the lake. The first day, Ethan rode a bike without training wheels. They paused at a photo of Madeline holding Ethan, freshly born, her hair still damp with sweat, eyes brimming with tears. She looked young, almost fragile. There was no sign of the woman who would one day betray them both. Just love, pure and raw. She wasn't always like this, Ethan said quietly. No, Jacob answered. Neither was I. That night, Jacob and Madeline stood in the living room again, the place where everything had once shattered. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the weight she carried, of her choices, of their broken trust, of the boy upstairs trying to rebuild a map of his own heart. I need to ask you something, Jacob said finally, and I need the truth, all of it. Madeline nodded. Okay. Why him? Why then? Her voice was small. Because I felt like I was disappearing, Jacob. You were so busy building empires, saving everyone else, and I didn't know how to say I was drowning. He noticed me. That's all it was. He noticed. Jacob didn't look away. And now I notice myself, she whispered, and I hate what I see, but I'm trying to change. He studied her, trying to gauge if remorse was enough. It wasn't, but maybe it was the start of something. I still don't know if I can stay, he said honestly, Not just for Ethan's sake, for mine. I'm tired of being a man who lives with a lie just because it's easier than leaving. I understand, but I also don't want to teach our son that love disappears the moment it's tested. Madeline blinked back tears. So what does that mean? Jacob exhaled. It means I'm staying, for now, but not out of duty, not for appearances. I'm staying to see if something true still exists between us. And if it doesn't, I'll leave with peace. But I need to know I tried. Madeline didn't fall into his arms. She didn't cry or plead. She simply nodded. Then I'll try too, not to win you back, but to become someone worth loving again. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a construction site, unsteady, half-ruined, but with foundations still holding. Upstairs, Ethan listened through the slightly ajar door, and for the first time he allowed himself to believe that broken things could be rebuilt. Not perfectly, but honestly. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Weeks passed. Not quickly, not painlessly, but with purpose. The house was quieter now, not from discomfort, but from an unspoken agreement to listen more and speak less. Some silences carried tension. Others offered a fragile kind of comfort. It was the silence of rebuilding, not retreat. Jacob returned to work, but not with the same fire he once had. He took fewer late meetings, came home early enough to help Ethan with his homework, and occasionally lingered at the dinner table longer than necessary. He no longer measured success by the deals he closed, but by the moments he stayed present, moments he used to overlook. Madeline took small steps. She enrolled in therapy. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, unsure if she was helping others or seeking a mirror for her own redemption. She didn't ask for Jacob's praise or Ethan's forgiveness. She simply showed up every day, hoping her actions would speak louder than the shame she carried. Ethan remained guarded. He was still young, but he was no longer naive. His eyes held a sharpness now, a caution he had earned too soon. And yet he laughed more than before, not because the pain had vanished, but because his parents had stopped pretending. And in that honesty, he found room to breathe. One evening, as fall settled over the city, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sky shift colors. No one spoke. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the kind of quiet only autumn could bring. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I don't think I'll ever forget what happened. Madeline turned to him slowly. I wouldn't expect you to. He looked at his mother, then at his father. But I think I can stop holding it like it's mine to carry. Jacob's hand found his son's shoulder, firm and steady. It never was yours to carry. That was our mistake. Ethan nodded. Then I forgive you. The words fell like leaves, gentle but final. Madeline didn't weep. She didn't rush to hug him. She simply closed her eyes, breathed in the truth of that moment, and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't a storybook ending. The scars were still there, visible and not. Trust was not fully restored and might never be, but something softer had taken root. A mutual understanding that love, when fractured, didn't have to die. It could be reshaped, even redefined, through honesty, effort, and time. Later that night, Jacob stood at the bedroom window, watching the lights of the city blink back at him. Madeline approached quietly, stopping a few feet away. Do you ever wish you had just walked away? She asked. He didn't answer right away. Sometimes, he admitted, but mostly I'm glad I didn't. She looked down, voice low. I'm sorry for everything I destroyed. Jacob turned to her, weary but clear-eyed. You didn't destroy everything, just the illusions. And maybe that needed to happen. They didn't touch. They didn't declare love. But they stood in the same room, with open eyes and open wounds, willing to try again. Not to reclaim the past, but to build something real from what remained. In the end, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about learning to live honestly after the worst parts had already been exposed. And for this family, that was enough. Chaka de